What's going on, guys? Jay here. This is smarthelping.com. Like and subscribe. Normally, I don't do this, but um, well, I guess I used to do it a lot where I do live financial modeling, but now I've been building things off stream and then just doing overview videos. I thought this might be an interesting one to talk through. I've just started kind of structuring the layout of this financial model for doing urban farming, which is hydroponics, aeroponics. Essentially, you're growing things in buildings and you're selling them. And you can market it as, pesticide free. There's a bunch of stuff with that. But the main thing I'm trying to figure out is the best way to economically model a financial forecast for such a business. So this is a ground floor of a model. I've already so the wrapping of the template, like I've got financial statements here that I'll fill in re-update, but I've got a nice base because I've got a whole bunch of different. Obviously, I've got hundreds of financial model templates I can pull from. So I try to pick the best one that fit the most amount of logic that's going to be required, and then I go from there. So here, right now I'm going to have to rebuild all the revenue logic. That's the main thing is all the revenue is separate or new. That's not able to be replicated anyway because that's one of the values of the financial models I build is that the assumptions are unique to whatever business is for. No logic is reused as far as how revenue is generated. That's the most unique thing. And then sometimes the expenses like the fixed costs, running costs, like this is pretty straightforward. Like we could put in here rent and a start month and a monthly amount over time. Like that's not really going to change. These fixed costs are usually. I might add some more slots here, maybe 100, but that logic's pretty simple. Now variable costs here, this is not going to work. This is for this original thing was for building or scaling out ATM machine business, so that's not relevant. I will be, we'll have to figure out essentially, and what I've thought is the best way to scale this is going to be through square footage. So we're going to define a total, essentially farmable square footage that you're purchasing. And again, purchases of buildings and equipment stuff can all be defined here on the CapEx. So that logic is nice and neat and good and intact. So we can use that. Um, but we're going to define the square footage, which we'll have to add in an input for that. The square footage of how much area you're producing and potentially expanding that square footage. Now, I want this to work for like a single use or potentially scaling. Now, the thing with scaling it is we're going to have to define, okay, what's your square footage for each of these produce types? And then what is your square footage over time? And then maybe we take this percentage of each of these initial ones and apply it that way. Now the thing with expansion is whenever you plan on adding square feet, you have to add in the capex table on the relevant time mean, which you can do by month. When are you expanding? How much does that cost? Or does if you're renting, you'd add like, rent for option one, rent for, option two, option three, etc. And so you scale so your rent will start to rise as you expand. Either way, we'll have to do something for that. But I think square footage is the best metric. And then we're going to define, I believe, the yield per square foot. Now, what I mean by yield per square foot is, let's say we got lettuce here, and I think I misspelled this. I actually don't know. Let's say we have lettuce, and let's say the yield is 3 heads of lettuce per square foot. And it takes, on average, 1.15 months to grow, in that square foot. It takes 1.15 months to grow 3 heads of cabbage. Okay, so I know, let's say if I had 1,000 square feet for each head of cabbage, I can say, well, I got 1,000 square feet. I do 3 heads there. So my yield is 3,000 heads every 1.15 months. in that scenario. So I haven't added this logic yet, and once I'm finished with this model, I'll do the overview. But this is just a little sneak peek at the building process, the beginning, um, and so one thing I'm thinking about, and I don't know actually how I'm going to do it yet, is do we say, because in theory, that cash flow will come at the end of the growth cycle. It's not going to be cut at the beginning. And if you have a longer growth cycle, like from what I was researching, strawberries. Now, hydroponics, from what I researched, makes the growth cycles up to 50% shorter or 50% faster. They grow 50% faster or something like that. I don't know exactly what the stat was. I can't remember. But the whole point, one of the points of this is that you can grow things faster. So the trick is, if you had a strawberry cycle of 20 weeks or 4.5 months, that cash isn't going to come evenly between those 4.6 months. It's going to come at the end of 4.6 months. Now, in the long run, like say a 10-year model, you can roughly figure out every year how many you're going to do in total, how much revenue is that. But for proper initial forecasting for the cash flow, it could become problematic because if you're recognizing that revenue is being generated evenly over this 4.6 months instead of just at the end, and we're trying to figure out the startup costs and equity requirements based on all the different equipment and the running costs, and then offset against the revenue, and then you figure out like on your cash flow what's your cumulative cash flow, what's the minimum it gets to, and that's your minimum equity, and that takes everything into account. So we could potentially be understating the minimum equity required. In the long run, I'm fine with just saying, okay, just take the essentially growth cycles per month, in this case 0.22, multiply that by the yield, and whatever, if you're selling it by the unit or by the pound or whatever, that's another option input that needs to be put in the pricing per those units. You just multiply that by this, and that's the revenue per month for each of the different types, and then that's our forecast. So that's what I'm leaning toward, but again, you could potentially see working capital issues because you're not actually getting, if you're doing longer growth cycles, you're going to see, a 4 month period where you're saying that cash is coming in, but actually it's not coming. The same amount will come in, but it's not coming in until the end of the 4.5 months. Now, for a lot of these other ones where the growth time is 1 or 2 months, you'll stabilize pretty quickly, so it's not a huge issue. And I think using this method here, like growth cycles per month, I think that makes sense. So I don't. That's one thing I'm struggling with. I'm probably leaning towards just doing a normalized monthly amount and just saying, in the first year, you might want to consider your growth cycle length and assume you might need some of that cash up front. Now, the other way, the more complicated way, but the more technically accurate way to forecast this would be to have like an age per cycle. Now, this would get really complex, but we could say, what percentage of the total yield that each cycle is going to produce, what percentage of that is collected, um, and when. And essentially you would just say, well, it's collected if it's, you do like a round up and just assume 5 months for this. So in month 5 from the initial growth cycle, you would collect all the cash that was generated on that yield. And then you could do like a percentage of, um, you could do a percentage of, what was my train of thought? A percent is, you might have some waste. You might not be able to sell it all. There's all kinds of variables. So maybe like you say of the 100% yield, maybe you can sell 80% of it or something. That could be a dynamic input. That would apply no matter how we do this. Also, what else do we got to figure out here? Well, still talking about revenue. I'm still trying to think about I guess we would have, so we'd have like a cohort and we'd say, okay, now that'd be tough. Could you have to do essentially a matrix for each individual type, and that would really limit the amount of types we can scale to. And so I'm trying to weigh that offset towards, what's better, having super accurate cash flow or potentially just normalizing the cash flow over the growth cycle period. It is tricky because a lot of the cycles are between 4 and 6 weeks, 7 weeks. It's not strictly by months. So I want to get a more accurate way. So I think this is a more accurate way to normalize it. But the question is, do we do offsets on when the cash happens? Um, and it's tricky. If like the monthly ones are not a big deal. If this is over one, like here, cilantro, we can do it in actually under a month. So our yield's actually slightly higher per month. On average. Now, all the numbers will normalize over a longer period, like I was saying. Like that, the numbers will be accurate, but we're trying to still figure out what's the minimum equity requirement to get this thing going and keep your cash above zero while you're stabilizing. That's one of the things I do in all the startup financial models you'll see on the site is they're solving for minimum equity required based on all this stuff. So I don't know. I mean, we could do a matrix saying, okay, here's this one. Lettuce, we could say it's purchased, you got to buy all the stuff for it. And then another thing is every tranche or for every cycle, you're going to have a variable cost that says, how much nutrient stuff do you need? How much water or mist do you need? I don't know. There's a whole bunch of stuff I was looking at for. We'll have to have a bunch of variable costs for each growth cycle, and then we'll also have the fixed costs for like rent, utilities, other things that aren't directly related to the production. Now, the other thing, and this is where it becomes, what do I tailor it for large scale, or do I tailor it for like a single operation that might expand a little bit because you don't want to have to, and it's possible, but you don't want to have to try to time everything up precisely if you're doing like, let's say 5 locations expanded over 10 years, and you want to say, well, my square footage is going to scale X, Y, and Z over the 10 years. And each time you scale up, you have to go back here to the CapEx and figure out when's my scale up happening, what are the initial equipment costs and all that, and apply that. That's possible, but what if you had like 15 locations you wanted to scale up to, or 30 or 50 or 100, and then manually doing that spend, figuring out when that is less doable. With this type of model, we'd have to figure out more of a dynamic way to scale the fixed cost, the variable, or the initial capex of these things. So, these are all things that go into figuring out how to build a financial model of the quality that I like to put out there, and I am considering all of these aspects. Uh, okay, well, back to the revenue generation. Hmm. Trying to think what is the best way to do this? So if I knew an easy way, I would simply just say the cash comes at the end of each cycle and dynamically do that. And then you could change the cycle times for these and everything would update. I'm trying to think if there's a nice, easy way to do that. I'm not sure. Also, scaling the square footage is going to be a little tricky to automate. I mean, I don't know or maybe I do if there's enough demand for this type of a model, maybe I'll take requests or put in logic so you've got one version that's built for like a single location with a set amount of square feet, and you just run this whole financial feasibility study and figure out, okay, what needs to be true for this location to make this amount of profit or at least break even. That's what is probably going to be the first version. If it's popular, I might build a second because it's going to have to be built differently with how you're scaling locations. Um, a lot of the assumptions are going to have to be rolled up higher so you get less granularity, but then you could scale to 5, 10, 20, 100 locations with a few, clicks of buttons and entering a couple data points about square footage, yields, um, and that would be a larger operation. This is still large. I mean, let's say you're going to do this in a new warehouse. It could be quite a big project. Um, so there's plenty of use for the model as it, is going to initially sit. Just thinking about what makes the most sense here. Obviously, ideally, you'd want to make something that works for both at the same time, but I don't think this scales easily with this amount of potential crops that you're going to be farming. And I'm actually kind of interested to see what has to be true and what the costs and revenues look like for these different things myself. Once I dive more into the numbers, I'm actually a bit curious about this and what the economics look like. So, so those are the things we are thinking about here on this model today. Like I said, normally for 2 solid years, I built everything I did live. And I stream on Mondays and Tuesdays for a while. I was doing it Mondays. I was doing it sometimes 4 or 5 days a week. But I got away from that. However, now that I got a little bit of time here, I feel like, hey, let's bring you guys back in. You can see a little bit of what's going on here. Uh, so again, all the financial statement stuff and that will be a product and how I end up having to structure all this into the different types of assets there are and all this stuff. That is a bit easier now for me because I've done so many different things. But the hard part here and the part that I believe makes the most, gives the user of these models the most value is figuring out what's the best way to structure the bottom-up assumptions for startup costs, revenues, variable and variable costs. That's the main meat of like the operating model, and then all this other stuff is summary will be summary outputs uh, to show what the economics look like of that. But all of that will will stem from however we build this thing here. So, so those are the things I'm thinking about. I want to let you guys go on that, and today is Wednesday. I'll probably have this model done by Monday, I believe. Or that's at least my target. We've been putting out new financial models pretty quickly in the past month or so, and I plan to keep that pace if I can on smarthelping.com. You can see recently we just did a general LBO model, which I've been meaning to do for a long time. That's useful for literally any acquisitions that are being done. Like that's very useful, and there's a lot of high-level assumptions in this one, but then also a lot of granular configurations of the high-level assumptions. I did a tenant management system, scaling up to 100 rental properties, cost segregation study. All these models I feel are very, very useful. And as I learn more and go through my journey of learning business logic and things, the models get better and better, and just having a lot of fun building everything. So far we've got over 150 templates, and if you want to check them all out, you can go to the home tab at smarthelping.com. Go down to here. You can get access to everything I've ever built for $9.99. I think it's a very fair price. For individual templates, you can see at the financial models tab at the top all the different individual templates that are included in that, and you can also buy them individually. or in other bundles, smaller bundles here, you can get. I've discounted heavily if you buy individual bundles, like 70 to 90% discount compared to buying individual templates. So there's just tons of value here. Uh, Anybody in finance will gain value from what is here. There is just a lot of knowledge I've built up and put into composable and digestible forms of logic that can be used for actually doing a study. It can also be used to learn like how different logic can be structured with pro formas and all kinds of stuff. All right. Well, that's all I got for you today, and I will see you whenever I get done with this hydroponic model, and I'll do the overview for it once it's fully completed. Hope you guys have a good one, and check you later.